There was a quiet longing that echoed through the corridors of everyday life, the kind that slipped between moments of stillness and busyness alike. Most didn't notice it, this subtle yearning buried beneath the noise of the world. But for some, it stirred like a whisper in the wind, asking, what is all of this really about? Why do I feel so scattered, so easily pulled by everything around me, yet so far from myself? The answer wasn't in a sudden revelation, nor in the rush of yet another dopamine hit. It was in something much older, much wiser, something that didn't shout but softly invited. It began with a choice to look inward. There was an understanding, ancient and enduring, that the source of our discomfort did not lie in the world, but in our relationship with it. And as one begins to peer beneath the surface, they start to see that it is not the chaos outside that leads us astray. It is the unrest within, the constant chase for stimulation, the addiction to movement, the discomfort with silence. When life becomes an unending stream of alerts, deadlines, notifications, and expectations, the mind grows weary, not because it is weak, but because it was never meant to run endlessly without rest. This was where the teachings of the old paths entered, not as a set of rules or restrictions, but as lanterns placed along the winding road. Among them, one ancient voice still rings clearer than most, the wisdom found in the heart of Buddhism. It offers not salvation through belief, but liberation through awareness, through presence, through coming back to oneself. And so, this journey began not with answers, but with honest questions. What am I really running from? What am I chasing? When did I forget how to just be? Buddhist philosophy in all its simplicity and depth suggests a radical truth, that suffering is not imposed upon us by the world, but generated within. That our pain often stems from our attachments, our clinging to desires, to identities, to control. And when we stop trying to grip so tightly, we begin to notice something extraordinary. That the peace we search for has been quietly waiting underneath all along. So much of modern distraction is driven not by necessity, but by a hunger we don't quite understand. A need to feel good, to feel seen, to escape the weight of stillness. But what if we no longer needed to escape? What if we met the present moment without armor, without filters, without expectation? The first gentle step is awareness. It doesn't arrive with thunder. It comes like the first breath after realizing you've been holding it. You notice the way your hands tighten when you're anxious, the way your shoulders rise with tension, the way your mind leaps from one unfinished thought to the next like a bird searching for rest. And then you pause. In that pause, you learn that the power you've been looking for is not in controlling the world. It's in learning to navigate your own mind. A simple but profound realization. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. It is in this awareness that the practice of mindfulness takes root, not as an escape from life, but as a deeper engagement with it. Mindfulness is not about stopping thoughts. It's about seeing them clearly. It is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming present. As you begin to observe your thoughts, a beautiful shift happens. You start to see them not as facts, but as passing weather. Moods rise like storms and fall like rain. Joy visits like the sun peeking through clouds. And slowly you begin to realize you are the sky, not the storm. With this awareness comes the invitation to set clear intentions. Each morning becomes a doorway to presence. Before the world lays its weight upon you, you return to yourself. What do I want this day to be about? Not in tasks or achievements, but in qualities, in presence, in peace, in truth. And from this intention, a calm strength builds. You begin to protect your attention as if it were sacred, because it is. You guard your mornings from the flood of screens. You give your full presence to one task instead of fracturing your mind across 10. You create pockets of silence, not just for productivity, but for peace. Your environment becomes a reflection of your internal clarity. You clear the clutter not just from your desk, but from your heart. You begin to notice how much noise you had normalized, and in its absence, a deeper voice emerges, your own. This clarity also begins to transform the way you engage with suffering. You stop fighting pain with resistance. You start meeting it with curiosity. What is this discomfort trying to teach me? Where does this anger come from? What old wound is asking to be acknowledged? You begin to see that emotions are not enemies. They are messengers. And when you stop running from them, they no longer need to scream. One of the most surprising lessons comes when you explore what it means to truly focus. Not just in the sense of productivity, but in the sense of purpose. What am I choosing to center in my life? Is it aligned with who I truly want to become? Buddhism doesn't offer a prescription. It offers a path. The Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path are not commandments. They are invitations. They say, here is a way. Walk it with your eyes open. And as you walk, you begin to notice that the world itself becomes less threatening. Not because it changes, but because you do. You learn to turn inward, not to escape, but to anchor. The same mind that once scattered itself in 1,000 directions begins to gather. Not through force, but through gentleness, through practice. This is when you realize freedom isn't found in doing everything. It's found in choosing wisely, in doing fewer things more fully, in being where you are, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. You begin to schedule breaks not as luxuries, but as necessities. Time to wander, time to breathe, time to simply be. You stop apologizing for needing rest. You honor it as the soil from which all clarity grows. And in that rest, creativity stirs. New ideas arrive not in the middle of stress, but in the spaciousness of stillness. Insight doesn't need to be chased. It needs to be welcome. As you practice this way of being, your relationship with the world changes. You begin to see others not as distractions or threats, but as fellow travelers, each carrying burdens you cannot see, each doing their best with the tools they have. You offer compassion more freely, not because others earn it, but because your heart has room to give it. And in giving it, you heal parts of yourself you didn't even know were wounded. There is no grand arrival, no single moment when it all clicks and stays perfect forever. But there is a deepening, a slow, steady shift, a returning again and again to what matters. And in this returning, you discover that the life you longed for was never far away. It was always waiting in the stillness, in the breath, in the now. Not easy, but real. Not perfect, but true. And that is more than enough. There's something unexplainable that begins to happen when you finally learn to stop measuring your worth by the ticking of clocks and the crossing off of lists. At first, it feels like standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into a space where all the busyness you once depended on to define yourself no longer follows. But if you're brave enough to take the step, what you find isn't a fall, it's a landing, a return, a deep breath into a place you forgot existed, yourself. He used to wake up and scroll, his eyes barely adjusted to light, and already the world was rushing in. Headlines, images, voices, all demanding his attention before he'd even remembered what his own voice sounded like. There was never a moment to check in with himself. It was always the world first, self later, if at all. And so the days blurred, each one weighed down with the same invisible pressure to do more, to know more, to keep up. But now things were different. Now he began his mornings in silence. Not always long, sometimes just a few minutes, but enough to feel himself arrive. He would sit, sometimes cross-legged on the floor, other times simply upright in bed. He'd bring a hand to his chest and feel the gentle rhythm there. That was the first miracle, that the heart kept beating even when he forgot to listen to it. He would breathe and say nothing. Do nothing, just notice. And in that noticing, a doorway would open, a doorway into stillness. It didn't make the noise go away, but it made space around the noise, enough space to choose, to decide what mattered and what didn't, to respond rather than react. This wasn't the kind of stillness that needed to be protected behind retreat walls or far-off temples. It was the stillness of someone who had decided fully to live awake, to meet each moment not with panic but with presence. He began to reimagine what focus meant. Focus wasn't about obsession. It wasn't about chasing a single goal to the exclusion of all else. It was about depth, about engaging fully with one thing, one person, one moment at a time. When he washed the dishes, he felt the water. When he walked outside, he noticed how the wind played with the leaves. When he spoke to someone, he looked them in the eye. It wasn't perfection, but it was real, and it changed everything. Because life stopped being something he had to get through. It became something he got to meet. And that shift, from endurance to presence, was the beginning of peace. He no longer pushed his emotions aside. When frustration rose, he didn't shame himself. When sadness visited, he didn't try to force it out. He treated his feelings like guests. Some stayed longer than others. Some were loud, some were quiet. But all of them had something to teach. And as he listened, he learned. He learned that beneath anger, there was often pain. That beneath anxiety, there was often a fear of not being enough. That even beneath joy, there could be a flicker of grief. For the moments he hadn't allowed himself to feel this way before. And in all of it, he found compassion, not just for others, for himself. There was a time when compassion felt foreign. He had learned toughness, performance, being useful, being smart. He hadn't learned tenderness. He hadn't been taught to sit with himself without trying to fix or improve or rush. But now that tenderness was his superpower. When he forgot to meditate for days, he didn't spiral into guilt. He smiled gently and returned. When he snapped at someone he loved, he paused, apologized, and tried again. When he felt the pull of distraction, he didn't judge himself. He noticed, breathed, and chose whether to follow it or not. That was the gift of mindfulness, not the elimination of mistakes, but the widening of the space around them. The ability to notice without collapse, the strength to course correct without shame. He also began to recognize how much of his suffering came not from what happened, but from how tightly he held on to it. The stories he replayed, the grudges he clung to, the self-criticism that echoed long after the mistake was made. And slowly, softly, he began to let go. Not with resentment, with gratitude. He thanked the moments that taught him. He blessed the versions of himself that survived when he didn't know better. He bowed to the past, not to worship it, but to release it. And in doing so, he created space. Space to live, space to love, space to forgive, space to dream. And into that space, something new began to flow. Intuition. That quiet voice he had ignored for so long was no longer buried beneath noise. It rose like steam from a quiet teacup. Subtle but sure. It told him when to rest, when to reach out, when to say yes, and more importantly, when to say no. It didn't always make sense to others, but it made sense to him, and that was enough. He no longer needed external permission to follow what felt right. He stopped saying yes just to avoid discomfort. He stopped saying maybe when he meant no. He stopped pretending to be fine when he wasn't. He stopped living for applause and started living for alignment. Because he realized that the people who mattered didn't want his performance. They wanted his truth. And truth, he had found, was the most healing force of all. It wasn't always comfortable. Sometimes it asked him to face things he'd rather ignore. Sometimes it meant letting go of relationships, roles, or beliefs that had once felt essential. But each time he followed it, he felt lighter, freer, closer to home. And home, he realized, wasn't a place. It wasn't a destination. It was a way of being. Home was the version of himself that didn't need to hustle for worth. Home was the breath he took when he stopped trying to prove and started trying to feel. Home was the calm beneath the chaos, the center beneath the spin, the presence beneath the pressure, and he could return to it at any time, with one breath, one pause, one moment of real attention. And in that moment, the whole world softened, because the noise was never the enemy. The forgetting was. And now he was remembering who he was, why he was here, and how deeply beautiful it was to simply be. There comes a point when you no longer feel the need to explain your silence to the world. You just fall into it, not as an escape, but as a return. That's what he had started to understand. Silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of everything that mattered. He had spent so much of his life trying to fill the space, to justify every pause, to make his presence constantly useful, constantly validated, constantly visible. But now, as he moved through his days with a slower breath and a softer voice, he began to trust the stillness more than the noise. In the quiet, he heard things that used to go unnoticed, the way the trees spoke with their leaves, the way his own breath changed when his thoughts shifted, the way a single sentence from a stranger could open something deep inside. And it was in this listening that he realized, most of life isn't about doing, it's about witnessing. He started witnessing himself in ways he never had before. He noticed when his smile was real and when it was a mask. He noticed how his stomach tightened when he agreed to something that didn't sit right with his spirit. He noticed how his energy shifted around certain people, how some spaces drained him and others filled him. These weren't judgments, they were invitations. Invitations to be more honest, to stop ignoring the quiet signals that his body, his heart, his intuition had been sending all along. And so he followed them, not always perfectly, but sincerely. He chose presence over performance, not out of rebellion, but out of reverence. Reverence for the one life he had. Reverence for the truth he had so long buried beneath what was expected of him. Reverence for the boy inside who just wanted to be seen without needing to earn it. There were days when this new way of living felt like walking through fog. The old habits still whispered to him, be productive, be impressive, don't waste time. And there were moments when he would catch himself spiraling into those old patterns. He'd start rushing again, overcommitting, checking boxes. But now there was a difference. Now he caught himself. He paused, he breathed, he returned. Because he had come to understand something sacred. Returning is the real practice. Not staying perfect, not never slipping, but returning with compassion, with kindness, with patience. He began to treat himself the way he had always longed for someone else to treat him, with understanding, with gentleness, with unwavering belief that he was worthy of love exactly as he was. The world around him didn't change overnight. There were still obligations, still distractions, still people who didn't understand this quieter version of him. Some relationships grew distant, some ended, but instead of chasing them, instead of trying to explain or prove, he let them go, not with bitterness, but with peace, because he understood now that not everything is meant to be carried forever. Some things serve their purpose and then release you. Some people walk with you for a season and then their path diverges. It's not a failure, it's life. And he was done resisting life, done clinging to what no longer aligned, done trying to force things to stay just because they once felt familiar. And in that release, new things began to arrive. Conversations that nourished him, connections that required no masks, moments that felt so deeply real they made him forget about time altogether. He found joy in the simplest things: a handwritten note, the smell of rain, a quiet evening spent in reflection. These weren't grand, flashy joys, but they were honest, and that honesty made them sacred. For the first time in his life, he didn't need to chase happiness. He found it, gently waiting in the moments he had always rushed past. Happiness, he realized, wasn't a destination. It was a way of being with whatever is. A way of saying, this too belongs. He began speaking differently, not louder or more eloquently, but more truthfully. He no longer said things to fill space. He spoke only when his words came from the heart, and when they didn't, he stayed quiet. That silence, once awkward, now felt powerful. It created room for deeper connection. It created space for others to open. He no longer needed to be the most interesting person in the room. He just wanted to be the most honest. And in that honesty, he found depth. He found presence. He found peace. There were still wounds he carried, old stories, past mistakes, regrets that lingered like shadows. But now he didn't try to outrun them. He sat with them, held them, let them speak. Some days the pain returned with a heaviness that made him question everything. But instead of collapsing under it, he softened. He whispered to himself, "You are still growing." He let the tears come when they needed to. He didn't apologize for his grief. Grief, too, had something to teach. And in its own way, it brought him closer to what was real. Because the deeper the grief, the deeper the love it came from. And he was no longer afraid of feeling fully, even if it hurt. He had stopped searching for shortcuts, for the quick fix, for the next big revelation that would suddenly make everything clear. He understood now that clarity doesn't arrive all at once. It unfolds, slowly, like dawn. And sometimes it only comes when you're quiet enough to notice it. So he made space for quiet, for long walks with no destination, for journals filled not with goals but with questions, for evenings spent alone, not in loneliness, but in communion with his own soul. He had stopped trying to escape himself, and in doing so, he had finally come home. This home wasn't made of walls or routines or achievements. It was made of presence, of truth, of deep listening. And he guarded it, not with walls, but with awareness. He said no more often now, not to be difficult, but to stay honest. He didn't explain his boundaries. He lived them. And the more he honored his own energy, the more life responded with grace. Opportunities arrived without force. People showed up without needing to be chased. Life began to feel like a dance again, not a battle. A flow, not a fight. He understood now that wisdom wasn't about having all the answers. It was about asking better questions, about staying curious, about remaining open, even when the world tried to harden him. He had seen too much, lost too much, loved too deeply to pretend otherwise. But that depth had not broken him. It had shaped him, carved him into someone who no longer feared the dark because he had learned to carry his own light. And so each day became a practice, not of perfection, but of presence, not of performance, but of truth. He wasn't trying to be someone else. He was remembering who he had always been. And in that remembering, he found everything he had ever been looking for. There was a shift in how he began to see time, not as a constant enemy running out, but as a space to unfold into. He no longer viewed every passing minute as something he had to conquer or fill, but as an invitation to be more intentional, to breathe deeper into the present moment. Time slowed for him not because the clock ticked any differently, but because his relationship with each moment had changed. He wasn't trying to get somewhere anymore. He had finally allowed himself to be here, right here, and the beauty of that simple shift was profound. Mornings became sacred, not because of what he accomplished, but because of how he arrived into them. Afternoons weren't wasted when spent in reflection or stillness. Evenings no longer served as mere recoveries from exhaustion, but as soft transitions into restoration. Time stopped being something he feared and started becoming something he cherished. He also noticed how his relationships began to mirror this new stillness. The frantic energy of needing to be liked, to be admired, to be included. It all faded. He no longer chased connection. He nurtured it, and that change altered everything. He saw clearly how much of his previous social behavior had been rooted in fear. Fear of abandonment, of rejection, of not being enough. So he had laughed at the right moments, said the right things, stayed silent when he had so much to say, just to preserve the illusion of harmony. But harmony that comes at the cost of your truth is not harmony. It's self-betrayal. And he was no longer willing to pay that price. He started speaking with more honesty, even if his voice shook. He didn't always have the right words. Sometimes he simply said, "This doesn't feel right," or "I don't know how to explain it, but I need space." And even when others didn't understand, he held his ground, because he had finally come to value his own peace over temporary approval. And the more he lived in alignment with what felt true, the more peace became his natural state. Not the fleeting peace that comes from avoidance, but the steady kind that roots itself in integrity. There were people who walked away, some quietly, others with loud misunderstanding, but he didn't try to pull them back. He let them go, not because he didn't care, but because he cared enough not to distort himself into a shape that no longer fit. And for the ones who stayed, the ones who respected his boundaries, who celebrated his growth, who met him in his truth, he held them closer than ever. Not out of dependency, but out of deep appreciation. These connections became sanctuaries. Not perfect, but safe. Not constant, but real. He started to see love differently too. He no longer thought love was something to find. He realized it was something to become. And the more he became love, through patience, through presence, through compassion, the more it returned to him in unexpected ways. A stranger holding the door with a smile, a friend remembering a detail he thought had gone unnoticed, a quiet text from someone saying, "I thought of you today." These small gestures became reminders that love doesn't always arrive in grand declarations. Often it's quiet, gentle. It lingers in the spaces we once rushed past. Even his self-talk transformed. The inner critic, once sharp and relentless, softened into a mentor. Not one that ignored his flaws, but one that saw them with kindness. When he made mistakes, he didn't spiral into shame. He reflected, he learned. He apologized when needed, forgave when possible, and moved forward with gentleness. He treated himself like someone worth being kind to. And in doing so, he taught others how to treat him too. He stopped trying to be the best in the room. He started trying to be the most present. When someone spoke, he listened, not just to their words, but to their silence. When he responded, he did so from the heart, not from a need to be impressive. And this shift deepened his connections. People opened up to him not because he had all the answers, but because he made them feel seen. That became his gift, not to solve, but to see, to witness without judgment, to love without conditions. He began to find sacredness in the ordinary. A cup of tea became a meditation. Folding laundry became a practice in gratitude. Cooking a simple meal became a dance between nourishment and creation. These moments, once overlooked, now carried a quiet magic. Because he was no longer rushing to the next thing. He was here, and being here, truly here, turned even the most mundane acts into ceremonies of presence. He no longer viewed healing as a destination. He stopped waiting for the day he would be fully fixed, fully whole, fully done. He understood now that healing was cyclical, that some wounds reopen not because you're broken, but because you're deeper now. You're ready to feel what you once couldn't. And instead of being discouraged by the reappearance of old emotions, he welcomed them, not with open arms always, but with a willingness to sit and listen. What are you here to teach me now? What part of me still longs to be heard, to be held? He found immense strength in softness. He had once believed strength was about holding it together, about never showing weakness. But he learned that true strength was being able to cry without shame, to ask for help without guilt, to say, "I don't know," and still feel secure in who he was. This kind of strength didn't come from armor. It came from authenticity, from being rooted in his own truth so deeply that he no longer needed to pretend. There were days when his old self would whisper back, tempting him with the illusion of certainty, of control, of the fast life he used to chase. And on those days, he didn't push the voice away. He just smiled and said, "I remember you, but I've chosen differently now." And then he would breathe, walk, journal, meditate, call a friend, sit in stillness, do whatever it took to return, not to an ideal version of himself, but to the real one. Because the real version was enough, always had been. There was a strange kind of freedom that came with no longer needing to be extraordinary. He had spent so many years exhausting himself in the pursuit of being more capable, more likable, more successful, more enlightened, as if who he already was could never be enough without some constant striving. But the deeper he stepped into presence, the more he discovered that peace wasn't found in the extraordinary. It lived in the deeply ordinary, in the moments when no one was watching, in the pauses between doing, in the slow, gentle exhale of someone who has finally stopped running. He no longer needed the world to see him in order to feel worthy. He only needed to see himself clearly. And in those honest glances inward, without judgment, without shame, he found something more valuable than approval. He found acceptance. He began to understand that self-love wasn't about standing in front of a mirror reciting affirmations or always feeling positive. It was about choosing himself in small, unremarkable ways. Choosing to rest when his body asked. Choosing to say no when his soul whispered that something wasn't aligned. Choosing to step away from conversations that drained him, from roles that confined him, from expectations that belonged to someone else. This wasn't selfishness. It was sacred responsibility. And the more he honored this, the more life began to feel like a gentle unfolding, not a rigid performance. Some days that unfolding brought tears, not the kind that came from pain necessarily, but the kind that came from recognition, from realizing just how long he had abandoned parts of himself in order to be accepted, from remembering the things he once loved and had forgotten to make space for, from realizing that it was okay to miss who he used to be, even while embracing who he was becoming. He didn't judge the tears. He let them fall, let them cleanse, let them soften the edges that had grown sharp through years of pretending. He began to see crying not as a weakness, but as a return to water, his body's own language of release. He didn't rush his healing anymore. There was a time when he wanted to fast-track it all, to read every book, follow every practice, do every meditation until he finally got there. But now he saw that there was no there, only here. And the more present he became with here, the less he needed to fix anything. Healing, he learned, wasn't always about doing. Sometimes it was about being, about letting what hurt be acknowledged, about letting what was numb come back to life, about letting what was tight finally relax, even if just for a moment. And in those moments of relaxation, something profound began to happen. Insight, clarity, creativity. They didn't arrive when he forced them. They flowed when he allowed them. He started creating again, not for applause, not for results, but for the sheer joy of it. A few lines written in a journal that made his heart feel full. A melody hummed under his breath while cleaning. A photo taken of something seemingly mundane, but beautiful in its stillness. He was no longer trying to impress. He was trying to express. And that expression, no matter how small, became a sacred act of honoring his aliveness. He also found himself letting go of certainty. There was a time when he clung to it, as if knowing what came next would somehow protect him from the discomfort of not being in control. But life had taught him, again and again, that control was often an illusion. And now, instead of resisting uncertainty, he breathed into it. He let it be his teacher, his reminder that faith wasn't about knowing, it was about trusting. Trusting that even if he didn't have the answers, he had the tools. That even if the path wasn't clear, he could take the next step. That even when he felt lost, he was still held by something greater, something that moved through all things, including him. He began seeing synchronicities again, the little signs that used to feel magical when he was younger. A repeated number, a song playing at just the right moment, a stranger's words echoing a thought he'd just had. These weren't coincidences. They were confirmations, affirmations that life was speaking to him softly but consistently through everything. And the more present he became, the more fluent he became in life's language. It wasn't a language of logic, it was a language of feeling, of energy, of resonance. And he began to trust that resonance more than he trusted the old metrics of success. Even his relationship with ambition changed. He no longer wanted to rise just to rise. He wanted to rise consciously, with integrity, with depth. He wanted his life's work to be rooted in his values, not in the projections of what he thought he was supposed to chase. He didn't want to be everywhere. He wanted to be exactly where he belonged. And in this new form of ambition, if it could even still be called that, he found joy. Not the adrenaline-fueled high of achievement, but the quiet, enduring joy of alignment. He started tending to his environment with more care, not out of perfectionism, but out of devotion. His space became a reflection of his inner world. Clean counters, lit candles, windows open to let the breeze carry away stagnant energy. A plant watered, not for aesthetics, but for the simple act of tending. Everything became an opportunity to infuse his energy with presence. And as his space softened, so did he. He also began to see that spirituality wasn't something separate from daily life. It wasn't confined to rituals or scriptures or meditation cushions. It was in the way he greeted the morning, in the way he held the door open for someone in a rush, in the way he said thank you to the barista and actually meant it, in the way he paused before reacting, even when he was triggered. That was the practice. That was the path. Showing up again and again with honesty, with humility, with heart. And when he didn't get it right, when he snapped, when he withdrew, when he slipped into old habits, he no longer used it as evidence that he had failed. He used it as a reminder that he was human, that the work wasn't about being perfect. It was about returning, always returning, with love, with grace, with a willingness to try again. And perhaps most importantly, he started to notice how peace wasn't something he had to chase anymore. It was something he could create in his breath, in his choices, in his presence. And even on the hard days, the ones filled with doubt, fatigue, confusion, he could still find moments of peace. A deep breath before a difficult call, a moment of stillness before sleep, a silent prayer in the middle of chaos. These moments weren't escapes. They were anchors, and they reminded him, again and again, that the most powerful transformation didn't come from escaping the mess. It came from showing up for it, fully, gently, honestly. He started finding meaning in moments that would have slipped through the cracks before. A walk taken without destination, the sound of rain on an empty road, a breath drawn in slowly and exhaled without force. These moments didn't perform. They didn't try to impress. But they held him in a way that was more real than any performance ever had. He didn't need grand revelations anymore to feel connected to something bigger. He needed presence, just presence. And when he gave himself that, even in the smallest increments, life whispered back. The world wasn't silent. It was just waiting for him to quiet down long enough to hear. And so he began listening, not just to words or ideas, but to feelings, to what rose in his chest when he thought of certain choices, to what happened in his stomach when he stood near certain people, to what his body was telling him when he forced himself to keep going after it begged him to rest. This awareness didn't make life easier. In some ways, it made it more complex, because now he could no longer ignore what he knew. He could no longer claim ignorance when his intuition spoke clearly. But that was part of growth. Not just learning new things, but unlearning the habit of betraying your own knowing. He had stopped glorifying the grind, the chase, the constant pursuit of more for too long. He had worshipped at the altar of productivity, believing that rest was laziness, that stillness was stagnation. But now he saw the lie in that, because some of the deepest healing, some of the most transformative wisdom, came not in doing more, but in pausing long enough to feel, to integrate, to truly arrive. He realized that his worth was never tied to how much he produced, how many steps he took in a day, how many people liked his posts or approved of his choices. His worth was innate, unshakable, present even when he was still, especially when he was still. As he spent more time in reflection, he also began to unravel the myth that his healing had to look like anyone else's. He stopped comparing his path to those around him. One person's breakthrough might come in therapy, another's in solitude, another's in art. His came in the slow return to truth, in long walks without his phone, in deep conversations where masks were left at the door, in sitting with a journal and asking himself questions no one else had dared to. There was no template, no perfect formula, just a rhythm, a deepening, a return. And sometimes that return meant revisiting old pain, not to dwell, but to understand. There were memories he thought he had outgrown that still echoed through his choices. There were patterns he hadn't seen clearly until he observed them without judgment. Like the way he over-explained himself when he felt misunderstood. The way he minimized his needs when someone else's seemed louder. The way he stayed silent to keep the peace, even when something inside him was screaming. These weren't flaws. They were coping mechanisms, survival tools crafted in a different chapter, and now with compassion, he could lay them down. He began replacing those patterns with presence. Instead of reacting, he paused. Instead of assuming, he asked. Instead of shrinking, he stood grounded. Not aggressively, but truthfully. He found strength in boundaries, not because they kept people out, but because they kept his spirit protected. Boundaries weren't walls. They were doors with locks that opened only to those who knocked with respect. And when he started honoring his own energy this way, life responded. He no longer attracted chaos. He attracted calm. Not because the world changed, but because his energy no longer aligned with anything less. He also learned to celebrate small wins, not because they led somewhere greater, but because they mattered on their own. Waking up and meditating for 5 minutes, that mattered. Saying no to a commitment that drained him, that mattered. Drinking water, stretching his back, turning off notifications for an hour, that mattered. He stopped measuring success in leaps and started measuring it in consistency. And in doing so, he realized that the life he wanted wasn't built in some distant future. It was built here, in these small, honest moments. Even his definition of happiness evolved. It wasn't about being up all the time. It wasn't about constant positivity or feeling good every day. It was about alignment, about living in a way that didn't betray his values, about choosing peace over approval, depth over comfort, truth over perfection. And even when that meant letting go of things that once felt essential, old dreams, old identities, old relationships, he trusted the release, because what remained after letting go always felt more honest. He had moments when the weight of his own evolution overwhelmed him. Growth isn't always beautiful. Sometimes it's messy and uncertain. Sometimes it means facing the parts of yourself you hoped you'd never have to meet again. The version of you who lied, who hurt others, who didn't know how to love well, who was too scared to speak up. But healing meant looking at those parts and saying, "You're not the enemy. You're part of the story, and I forgive you." Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't always a conversation with others. Sometimes it was a quiet ceremony with yourself. Lighting a candle and whispering, "I release you." Writing a letter you'll never send. Standing in the mirror and saying, "I'm sorry," followed by, "I love you." These rituals mattered, not because they changed the past, but because they changed your relationship to it. And in that change, he found space. Space for joy, for rest, for play. He began laughing more, not because life was easier, but because he was lighter. His laughter wasn't forced. It came from a place of surrender, of relief, of gratitude. Even when things weren't perfect, he could find something to smile about. The way a child ran down the street without worry. The way a dog stuck its head out of a car window. The way the wind made the trees dance just for a moment. These small joys became sacred. They didn't fix everything, but they reminded him that beauty still existed, even in chaos. He noticed how his presence affected others. When he walked into a room grounded, others softened. When he spoke from truth, people listened differently. When he held space for someone's pain without trying to fix it, they often cried, not out of sadness, but out of relief. His presence had become a balm, not because he had all the answers,